Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I have a great show for you guys. I have an amazing guest. We have Judge Mary Beth O'Connor with us this time, and it is truly a pleasure and an honor to have her here. I'm excited to have this discussion with her. We've scheduled this a couple months in advance. So before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and just kind of give everybody just a an overview, right, of who she is. And if you look her up, there's tons of information out there. But let me just go and give you a quick just summary of who she is. So Judge Mary Beth O'Connor is an award-winning author. She has a memoir called From Junkie to Judge: One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. And this is a bestseller. And at the end of the podcast, she's going to let us know how we can go ahead and get a copy of that book as well. Mary Beth began with alcohol at the age of 12. She's had a tough life, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. She spent several years abusing drugs. She got into methamphetamine at the age of 16, and then by the age of 17, she was shooting meth, right? And for those of you that understand that, right, it's pretty serious, right? It goes in degrees, and so she was doing that by the age of 17. Mary Beth struggled with meth until she was 32 years old. She now is a retired federal judge, and Mary Beth is on the advisory council of the Hyper Calling Foundation. Mary Beth is also a board member of the Life Ring Secular Recovery, and she is also the director and secretary for the She Recovers Foundation. Mary Beth speaks on behalf of these organizations about multiple paths to recovery and about all topics related to substance use, disorder, and recovery. She also speaks about recovering from traumas that include sexual abuse, rape, child abuse, domestic violence, PTSD, and anxiety. Mary Beth, thank you for being on the show. It is absolutely a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Awesome. And Mary Beth, where are you located?
So I grew up in Central Jersey, but I went to Berkeley for college and I never left. So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Nice, nice. That's interesting. Actually, that was when I was in high school. That was my dream to go to UC Berkeley. That was my number one school, and it didn't happen. I ended up going to USC, but it worked out well. But at the time, UC Berkeley was one of the best schools for engineering. So
Yes, but USC is nothing to sneeze at. I mean, that's an excellent school as well. So
yeah, awesome. Well, Mary Beth, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to go ahead and give everybody just an overview of what we'll be discussing today, and then we'll jump right into it. So we're going to go ahead and talk. So the first part of the conversation is going to be a little bit about your life, right? Some of the struggles, some of the key turning points in your life. And then we're going to go into maybe some areas related to the justice system, right? Areas like areas for improvement, right, if you will, and how that relates to maybe some of the policies that are in place right now, or policies that are maybe being, that they're in some states, right? We were just talking about that right before the podcast. Some new policies that are being seen, right, in other states. So, anyways, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into your childhood. So, you said you grew up in New Jersey. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood? What was that like?
yeah, I mean, it was challenging on a lot of levels. I mean, I was actually left for the first 6 months of my life at a nunnery and then 3 years with a great grandmother. But mostly my mother wasn't really bonded to me. She wasn't particularly interested in me. And she could be violent sometimes, but things got a lot worse when I was 9 and she married my stepfather. And he was very violent with her, which I think we really underappreciate the trauma of witnessing domestic violence against a parent. But also he was physically and sexually violent with me. So it was just a super high stress environment. I never knew what was going to happen to me when I woke up or walked in the door, and I didn't have control over it. I mean, I developed some strategies to try to reduce my risk of him getting violent, but I couldn't eliminate it. It was impossible. And so it was just sort of primed me to seek relief in all the wrong places because I needed to find a way to manage that anxiety.
Right. I read that at some point and I'm sure that was not the only instance, but at that one point he had kicked you in the stomach, right? He was upset about something, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was when I spilled milk. I think it was when I was giving the cat milk, and it was actually the cat's milk dish was outside. It wasn't even in the house. And so it just didn't matter what you did. The The example I like to use, because I think it shows the level of strain, is that when I realized who I was dealing with, and I was 9 and my little sister was 7, one of our chores was to put the dishes away from the dishwasher when we got home from school. And I taught my sister to put the dishes away one dish at a time so they didn't clack, because noise could trigger him. And so that's sort of the level of stress and strain that I had
Wow.
to develop a special process just to put the dishes away out of the dishwasher.
Wow, that's terrible. And that was from what age to what age?
I lived with him from when I was 9 until I went to college. So it was a long time.
That was a long time. Yeah. Did it gradually get better? Did it get worse? What was that like?
It never got better with him. I mean, he was always out of control. And not only that, but I started to be around risky people, right? It's common that women, for example, who are abused in the household later end up in abused relationships with boyfriends. And I did that. I actually moved in with a violent boyfriend in college. I was around a lot of people that weren't particularly safe. I didn't really understand that I had a right to sort of bodily integrity, or that I should be looking out for. I didn't know how to protect myself, or how to evaluate situations. It's weird because on one hand I was hyper vigilant. Like if you came behind me, I would jump if you said something. But on the other hand, the violence was so normalized to me that I didn't always appreciate the risk with new people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It's I don't know if you've heard, or read or heard about these studies that they've done, but whenever a child, right, grows up in an environment where they're constantly in that survival mode, there's a number of things that happen, not just psychologically, but biologically. And unless they really receive some serious help, right, it really carries with them for the rest of their lives.
That's true. I mean, for example, there's something you probably know called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Score. It's a set of 10 questions about different things in childhood. Were you subject to physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse? Was a parent incarcerated or violent against another parent? Poverty, I think, is one. And the higher you score on the ACE test, just as an example, the higher, if you score a 4 or more, your odds of developing an addiction, which today we call substance use disorder, is 3 or 4 times higher than the general population. And my score is 7 on the ACE score. So it's very
Wow.
high. But it does also play into things like the risk of developing anxiety or depression. And you're right, there are studies now that show that even in adulthood, like, decades later, your odds of developing an autoimmune disorder are higher, and there are other physical implications, medical implications from growing up in that kind of a household. It's also why when people ask me what's the number one thing we can do to reduce the addiction rate in America, which is one of the highest in the world, my answer to that is mental health treatment for children. Because as you suggest, if we can resolve it early, then they're not going to have the risk of all those lifelong consequences.
Right. And you said this was from age 9 through you going to college, or when you
Yeah.
started college, right? And that,
Yeah.
how old were you at that time when you started college?
I left New Jersey when I was 19 to go to California for college.
Okay. And at that point, you were still struggling with alcohol, and were you also struggling with meth at the time?
Yeah, so I started with alcohol when I was 12, and it was Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine, which I mentioned because it's a common introductory drug, right? But I added
Mhm.
in weed and pills, and I did a lot of LSD my sophomore year of high school. And at 16, I did find meth, which became my drug of choice right away. I mean, it was just for whatever reason, biochemically, it just fit me best, and it was the drug that I pursued. And so when I left for college, I was in very bad shape from the meth. But I did get better. So I left New Jersey to go to California. And for the first 3.5 years, I did more drugs than the people around me, but I did less than I had been. And in particular, I didn't do meth much for the first 3.5 years of college. So I used too much, a lot of alcohol, some hallucinogens, some cocaine, some pills. But I kept it a little bit more controlled. But then I had, as you mentioned, a very life-threatening kidnapping and 6-hour rape by 3 men. And I moved in with that violent boyfriend. And so like the little bit of grip that I had on it, I lost. And in January of my senior year of college, I started using meth again on a daily basis. And I used it until I was 32. So that was sort of
Wow.
the trajectory of my drug use.
Right. And what was the turning point? Because at 32, that's when you turned everything around, right? It sounds like.
Yeah, that's when I went to rehab. So, I know sometimes in the media it's portrayed like there's this light bulb moment or something that you decide to
Mhm.
get well. But for many of us, and for me, it was really a combination of factors. And by 32, I was having physical problems. I mean, meth is very toxic and it was showing up in my body. But mostly I was just, emotionally devastated. I was feeling very trapped. I couldn't hold a job. My partner was ready to throw me out. And so it was sort of all of those things combined that made me finally say, well, maybe I ought to go to rehab, and so
Right.
that's how it started. It's not that I was 100% committed to abstinence when I went to rehab. Most people, again, it's usually a process, right? But I was hoping to try to figure out how to make my life less miserable and less chaotic, because addiction is not fun. You're not out there having a good time anymore. The fun days of drug use are, years or decades behind you. So finally I was ready to at least give it a shot.
Right. And how long were you in rehab?
I did go into a longer term women's program. I went in, it was 90 days minimum, and I actually stayed 5 months. I didn't think 30 days was going to do
Nice.
it for me. And the other thing was I didn't have insurance and I didn't have money. So I had to actually get waitlisted. I had to wait 10 weeks on the wait list. I had to call every Monday between 9 and noon, or my name would drop to the bottom again. And that's one of the issues today. We sometimes talk about drug policy as if there's drug treatment available on demand, and that's just not true for many people. If you don't have insurance and you don't have cash, there's a large percentage of people that have drug use problems and that want help and they can't access it.
Right. Right. And so you get out of rehab, right? 5 months. And then what happens after that?
Yeah, so for me, my rehab was really 12-step focused, which is, Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and all of those anonymouses.
Sure.
And that's a good program for many, but it wasn't a good program for me, just like it isn't a good program for a notable percentage of us. So when I got home from rehab, I started building what's called a personal recovery plan. I found alternatives to 12 steps, and this is in 94. I got sober. I went to rehab in 93, and my sobriety date is January of 94. So I just had 30 years. I had 30 years earlier
Nice.
this year. Yeah. But so I started,
Congratulations.
thank you, thank you. Although I do emphasize that going from 29 to 30 is not the hard part. That's not the fun part. But so I
Right.
sought out other options because I wanted to, learn all I could. And I was reading the books for the other programs, what today would be Life Ring, what today would be Smart, and Women for Sobriety. So I was reading a lot of recovery books, different programs, ideas, and I was going to different meetings for different programs and sort of synthesizing the ideas for what I thought would work for me. But the other side is that when I got home from rehab, I started trauma therapy because I knew that my trauma, my violence history was underneath my drug use. And I also was aware that if I didn't resolve that, I was never going to be able to be happy or productive and maybe not able to stay sober. So I sought out a therapist who had expertise in trauma, and
Mhm.
she diagnosed me with PTSD, which I didn't know I had. And for me, it showed up as severe anxiety. And so I started tackling both of those together. And that's a common need. About 55% or more of people with substance use disorders, with addictions, they have other mental health conditions that they also need to address. And today we call that dual diagnosis or co-occurring disorder. So I was tackling both at the same time, which is what is recommended today.
Right. And is that common nowadays? Like, or is that more of a just something nuanced that's only seen more the exception, or as far as that approach?
So when I got sober, they actually told me that they wouldn't address my mental health until I had like 6 months sober because they wanted the drugs out of my system. But today, evidence-based practice is to address both simultaneously. There are, if you have a family member who, let's say, has depression or a psychotic disorder or anxiety and a substance use disorder, there are treatment programs that specifically have the expertise to treat people with dual diagnoses, with co-occurring disorders. And so you should look for that. On the other hand, sometimes they say that, and you do have to ask questions like exactly who's on your staff and is a psychiatrist there and all those other things. But The evidence shows that if you address both from the beginning, the odds of success are higher. And the way I describe it is, it's hard to stay sober if your mental health is out of control, and it's hard to get your mental health under control if you're not sober when you have an addiction. And so it really is about tackling both at the same time, because the recoveries are related. There's an interplay between the two recoveries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just talking to it just, coincidence, right? I was just talking to somebody this week, and I think it was 2 days ago. And she was telling me about her, right? She would love to be able to find a way to not be addicted to meth, right? So, and the way the conversation came about is she's got a boyfriend who's currently incarcerated, facing some charges, right? And anyways, but just kind of looking for some general guidance, right, on how to approach the situation, right? They were getting ready to go to trial. And it came up, right, that she's also struggling, right? She's trying to help him out, right, with his situation, but she's addicted to meth, and has been addicted to meth for a very long time as well. And she's now in her late 30s. It's interesting. If you talk to her, you if you just listen to her voice, you would never think that, that she's that age, right? So, which is interesting, that, I'm sure we can unpack that, and that'd be, interesting to understand. But I guess what really matters here is the point that she, she was talking about the challenges, the struggles with it, right? And I could hear the pain in her voice, right, when she was talking about that. And she started crying right during that conversation. Um, and I wouldn't be surprised if in her case it's similar, where she's got some underlying trauma, right? Who knows what it is, that's keeping her from being able to take those next steps, to make the right decisions, to start to get over it, right? Because she really wants to like change her life, but it's just it hasn't happened. It's been a while now, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, the truth is that for women in particular, there's a high rate of, sexual assault history, domestic violence history, child abuse history for people who use substances in excess for a long period of time. And so that is very possible. She may also be trying to self-medicate ADHD or some other mental health condition. But in the long run, for someone like her, the thing that might be of use is to try to help her, figure out a plan to move forward. And so I have some in the back of my book. I have a list of guidelines and suggestions for newcomers, for people who are thinking about treatment. For example, like what treatment should they consider? Inpatient treatment, intensive outpatient. If you can't afford that or don't have access, go into what peer support group might be good for you among the variety, or can you work with your a therapist? There are more therapists who have addiction expertise now than when I got sober 30 years ago. There's not enough, but if you look, sometimes you can find a psychologist who has expertise, or a doctor. And so there's a lot of different avenues into the recovery space. It doesn't have to be inpatient treatment only. But on the other hand, someone who's been using meth for a long time, inpatient might be the ideal option. It just doesn't mean that she'll be able to get it. But if you can't get it, it's important to figure out, what do I have access to? What resources can I access?
Right. And that's a perfect transition into a question that I've been meaning to ask you, right? One of the things that's unique about your transition, right, is that you did it with a secular recovery plan. And, and most of the plans that are out there, right, are Christian based, or LDS based, or, there's just different programs, right, that are religious, that there's a religious component to it, right? In your situation, you were able to do it through a more secular, right, approach. I'd love to ask you a little bit about that, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people in that situation. And how did you accomplish that? What was the key to being able to accomplish that, right? Given that you didn't have that other component.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple things. First of all, it's not like there's a clear, hard line that all the faith-based people go over here and all the non-faith-based go over there. There are a lot of atheists and agnostics that can make like 12 steps work, which has a higher power component. But there's also a lot of religious and spiritual people that choose the non-faith-based recovery programs because they don't like, let's say, 12 steps for a reason other than the higher power or God thing. And so a lot of the secular programs, like I'm involved in Life Ring, secular recovery, as an example. Our focus is on a more self-empowered recovery. In other words, we don't agree with that powerless idea or that you should turn your will and your life over. We actually believe that you should take control of your recovery, that you're the decision maker. That doesn't mean that we're saying do it alone. I mean, the group is there to help build a plan, but it's also that we are confident that the plan that works for you and the plan that works for me might not be the same. So it's about building what we call a personal recovery plan, an individual plan. And that's what I did. I didn't shut my ears down and say, I'm going to do it on my own. What I did instead was, I mean, 12 steps wasn't the right fit. I read all the 12 steps. I read AA Big Book. I read the NA text, and there were a few ideas I could use. I read the Women for Sobriety books. I read the Life Ring Parent books. I viewed it all as ideas and suggestions and techniques that I should consider and find the ones that I think will work for me. And that's sort of that individual nature of the plan. And it's not that it's so that type of approach, a lot of faith-based people do it as well. So it's not like that hard line between religion and non-religion. But that's what it was for me. It was that I felt like I needed to be this decision maker in my recovery. And for example, in mental health, the data shows that if you participate in building having choice in your mental health recovery plan, your mental health treatment plan, you do better. And so that's part of the idea, is that you can take control, you can be the owner. But we also in Life Ring emphasize, we have peer support meetings, right? The group is there to support you, but also to share ideas and information, so you can say to the group, let's say I'm going to go to a wedding with alcohol on Saturday. Any ideas to how I can handle it? Like, you can ask the group for suggestions. And so it's those kind of approaches that the non-faith-based programs tend to emphasize, and Life Ring is a good example of that.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I really, I did not understand that difference. So I appreciate that. I'm sure a lot of our listeners were also a little confused about that. So thank you. Mary Beth, I'd like to ask you, right? You've experienced life right at rock bottom, and then later you ascended to the prestigious position of a federal judge. Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, what was the interplay? I'd love to know how your past, right, informed your role as a judge. And maybe you can speak to a little bit about the type of judge that you were, right, within the federal court system.
Yeah, so I'm going to preface it first with a couple things. One is that we no longer emphasize this idea that you have to have a hard rock bottom. And so rock bottom was sort of it used to be said, well, no one's going to get better until they hit this like horrible rock bottom, but that actually isn't what the data shows. So substance use disorder, again, the modern name for addiction, it's a mental health condition. It's in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use. And you can have a substance use disorder on the spectrum, mild, moderate, or severe, just like you could have mild, moderate, or severe anxiety, or mild, moderate, or severe depression. And today we emphasize trying to get people to get their drug use under control at the mild or moderate level and not wait until the very severe level, right? It's to your advantage to stop it in its tracks at an earlier point. On the other hand, when I take that DSM test, I end up at the very severe level and I recovered. So it's not that you can't, it's just that we encourage people not to wait for that.
Sure.
And then as far as the judge thing, I will also emphasize the incremental nature of how I got there. So I got sober at 32. I mean, I was not young. I had a Berkeley degree and actually good grades and a horrible, embarrassing resume, because for the 10 years after college, I couldn't hold a job. And so I was like working my way down the corporate ladder. My resume was embarrassing. And when I got sober and got home from rehab, I mean, nobody was going to hire me for a career job, and I wasn't really ready for it. And so my first job when I got home was a low-level temporary administrative job. And I worked my way up sort of the administrative middle management over 6 years. And I went to law school, I went to Berkeley Law at 6.5 years sober. So that was, what it took. It was really about being realistic about where I was, and then what's the right next job? Okay, well, now what's the right next job after that? And how do I get the skills I need to get that job after that? And it was step by step by step. I certainly didn't get sober and think I would ever be a judge, like that wasn't on my radar. And
Right.
so I went to law school at 39. I was 39 years old when I started law school and 42 when I graduated. And then I worked as a lawyer for a number of years. And when I had 20 years sober, I was appointed a federal judge. And so it was really that, it's just, I like to use it as an example that what you can accomplish, taking that incremental step-by-step approach is really beyond your imagination when you first get sober. It's amazing what you can do in 2 or 5 or especially 20 years. And so that was sort of how I got there. And then as judge, I was a federal judge. I was a administrative law judge. And so in the federal government, that means you work for a specific agency, and I worked for Social Security. So I mostly did disability cases
Mhm.
and a little bit of other type of cases for Social Security. So that was the area that I was a judge for.
Okay. And before we dive deeper into your role as a judge, and because I'd love to ask you some of your opinions on some topics, right, that I create content on. Before we get to that, I'd love to ask you first. You described this journey, right, of from being sober at 32 and then going to law school at 39, graduating at 42, being appointed a judge, and right, that's incredibly difficult, right? It's there's almost insurmountable, what would appear to be insurmountable challenges all along the way. I'd love to ask you, what was your jet fuel? What was it that you were chasing at that time? What is it that kept you going? What were you running from?
Yeah, I mean, so throughout my childhood, the positive experience I had was school. I mean, I was always good at school. I always tested really high, had very high standardized test scores. So that was the one positive place in my life when I was a little girl. That's where I got positive attention. That's where I was seen. And so for me, that academic side, pushing yourself academically was sort of I think it was my natural personality, but it was also reinforced through the positive experiences I had as a child. And so when I got sober, I really wanted to, move my life forward as best I could. But for me, I like intellectual challenges. And so, yeah, law school is hard, but I like the challenge of it. The anxiety created problems because I was always, stressed out, but I like the challenge. And I always want to look at sort of what's the next challenge for me. Just like writing my book. I mean, I was a great legal writer, but when I started writing my memoir, I realized I actually didn't know how to write a memoir because it's written like a novel. And I like that. That makes it attractive. Oh, now I have to figure out how to do this, And so I like brain stimulation. I like new challenges. I like moving on to the next thing. And that's just sort of part of who I am. But it was also really reinforced because that was the one positive thing I had when I was young.
Yeah. So did you struggle at all with those 3 years of law school? I mean, or was it pretty, but did it feel like just like riding a bike and it was just like back to school and it was easy?
No, I mean, I went to law school not just at 39, but 16 years after I graduated college. I mean, it was a long haul. When I was in law school, I told my husband, I said, 2/3 of the class took a final in May, and I took a final 16 years ago. So there was that. But on the other hand, being older actually did have some advantages. I mean, I had been sober for 6.5 years. I had relearned how to be disciplined, how to prioritize, how to meet deadlines, how to get work done. I had all those skills again by the time I went to law school. And my life was actually more stable than a lot of the younger students, right? I mean, they're 22 years old. They just graduated from college. They're still in early relationships, or they're still dealing with emotional issues that I had addressed by that point. And so in some ways, it was easier for me. But I also just approached it in a disciplined way. Like I don't care what time I had class. I was at the law school by 8 a.m., even if I didn't have class until 11. And then I would just work for those couple hours. So I try to approach it as in a disciplined way, like a job. Here's the hours I'm going to do law school, right? And here's the hours on the weekend I'm going to do law school. And so I had built up my skill set so that I was ready for it by that point.
Right. Discipline is so important, and it's a skill that really yeah, that would be a skill that I would advocate for for children, right, for youth to be taught from a very early age. and in a very profound way, right? Not just in the, the way that it's taught, customarily, but it's such a valuable skill. I mean, it really is. And, it's
Yeah.
exactly.
It's a valuable skill, but it's also learnable. I mean, when I got sober, I had lost the connection to my intellectual self. I had lost the connection to my disciplined self. I had to rebuild that. And so it is an important skill, but it's a skill, right? I mean, it's a learnable skill. And
It
so if
is.
people start where they are and just focus on, developing what's the right next place to develop the skill set, it's available to all, I guess is my point. Anyone can develop that skill.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. Mary Beth, I'd like to transition over to one of the other subjects, right, that I'd like to cover. And we don't, it's not it's not every day that people get to talk to, right, or listen to a judge, right, talk about some of these topics that we're going to jump into right now. But I'd mentioned that, that it's one of the things that I'd like to discuss is accountability for judges, right? We're talking about how there's statutes, there's laws, there's our Bill of Rights and all these different things. But I'd love to get your take on, I guess all initially we'll just start off kind of broad. What is your take on the existing structure that's set in place for maybe for ensuring, right, that judges are fair, right? To use your word, making sure that judges are fair and that they do follow these guidelines, these statutes, that they do protect people's constitutional rights. What are your thoughts just generally, right, about the framework that's in place right now?
I mean, in general, the checks and balances are supposed to be that your decision can be appealed up until the Supreme Court level. Your decision can be appealed, and that is one of the checks and balances. And if you have a first of all, judges don't like to get overruled. And so getting overruled on something, for many of us, we take that seriously and we look at why we got overruled and we think about that when the next similar case comes up. And I will say, other than the Supreme Court, there actually are ethics rules for judges. I mean, when I was a judge, I had very strict ethics rules because I was a federal judge. Like, for example, about what I could do during the election cycle or what outside activities I could have or gifts. There were very specific rules. But, depending on the jurisdiction, like those rules wouldn't apply to a judge in Mississippi who works for a state court, right? So each jurisdiction has its different set of rules and different set of controls. But I will say, in my arena, which, that I focus on, which is the drug laws, there are definitely some problems about the way those drug laws are enforced that have real world ramifications. And so, for example, we act as if the drug laws are always fairly applied, like everyone's equally, you do the same behavior, you get the same punishment. But that's not actually how it is. The reality is that white people and people of color use drugs at very similar rates. But if you're a person of color, your odds of getting arrested and convicted and having the charges be felonies rather than misdemeanors and the sentences being longer, it's a very real racial disparity in the way that we enforce our drug laws. And that's really problematic. The other thing is that there are, these drug courts, and they're supposed to be helping. It's supposed to be a diversion. Don't go to jail, go to drug court, follow the rules. And if you follow the rules, you get your charges dismissed later. But there's some problems with that. One of them is that the quality of drug courts varies widely across the country. Some drug courts are very evidence-based. In other words, they understand the science. They follow the experts' recommendations about what treatment should look like. They understand things like, most people can't be 100% abstinent on day one. Like I used meth 3 times in my first 5 months, and that was actually really good compared to where it was, but it wasn't perfect. Or they force people to go into the wrong treatment program, or they only let people go to AA. They won't let them go to LifeRing, or they won't let them go to SMART, even though the evidence shows that AA doesn't work better. And so when the judges aren't keeping up with the science, or when they're not properly trained as far as drug charges go, and they're in these types of drug courts, also probationer, right? If you're on probation or parole, same problem. What happens is that people are not given a fair chance to succeed because the rules are sort of set up for a large percentage of people to fail. and or they're pushed into a treatment that's going to not give them the best chance of success because it's not the right approach for them. And so those are some of the problems in sort of my drug criminality arena. And then, of course, there's the criminality versus public health approach, which we could talk about. But once you get into the system, and part of the problem is that the judges are not taking the time to educate themselves about what our current understanding, the current experts' understanding about what works, what doesn't work, and what's the right approach.
Yeah, touched on a lot of interesting things there. I'm trying to decide where to start. Where to start? Well, let's start off with an easy one. So you mentioned the disparity, right? I'm wondering, is that something that, as far as kind of you went into the types of drugs that are used and who uses those, is that something that's still an issue, or is that something? Because I know that back in the '80s, that was definitely a major issue. In the '90s, is that still a major problem as far as based on the research or stuff that you read?
It is still a major problem. I mean, there's very current data about that. It's still a major problem. I mean, there's the examples like the way that the crack epidemic was treated compared to the way the opioid epidemic is being treated, right? When crack was prevalent, it was very much, these are horrible people. They're damaging the society. They're damaging their kids. We need to lock them up for 25 years. And with the opiate epidemic, in a way, because it was more widespread among different groups, it was more, oh, this actually is a public health problem. We need to help them. Well, there's no actual difference between, being addicted to crack and being addicted to heroin as far as moral culpability or your likelihood of getting addicted or what it says about you as a person, but they were treated very differently, those situations. But even separate from that, today,
Mhm.
the racial disparity still strongly exists, even in, like, I'm in California where it's not as bad, but it's still a significant problem.
Interesting. Okay. See, I didn't know that. So, and I've not read anything about that. I thought that was an issue that was more, like I said, from back, back in the '80s or '90s, right? So, the other question, right, to bring us back to the subject of judges and the structures that are in place. One of the things that I think some people don't understand, right, and I'd love to have you kind of speak to this a little bit, and we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper. But people have and from my experience, right? So it could totally be skewed, but it seems like people have in our society have this belief that the law, right, is black and white, right? Law and order, black and white. And they don't quite understand that there is so much discretion at every level, right? Starting with police officers, then continuing to prosecutors, right? What cases they decide to prosecute or not prosecute, or over prosecute or under prosecute, right? And then we get to judges, right? Like judges have so much discretion, right? Like it's whether you're talking about a holding, right? That the decision that's been made by a superior court, or whether it's interpreting the rules of evidence and how to apply them to a specific evidentiary ruling or constitutional right that somebody's invoking, right? They say my Fourth Amendment right to illegal search and seizure was violated or whatever, right? Like, but I'd love to have you just to kind of get us going. If you could just speak to that just a little bit.
I mean, there definitely is a lot of discretion. So, for example, some people think, oh, criminal defense attorneys, they're just defending people who are criminals. But the reality is, a lot of what a defense attorney's job is to get the charges to be right for what they did. Because a lot of times the police will tend to overcharge. They will charge you with 3 felonies when, in reality, you really should have been charged with a misdemeanor, or they'll pile up the charges to try to get you to plead guilty. They make you so afraid because they're giving you 5 charges and now you're facing 25 years in prison when really your behavior is deserving of 1 misdemeanor charge and 6 months in prison. And those kind of problems are significant. And you're right, judges. So even let's take a relatively neutral area of the law. When I was a lawyer, some of what I practiced in was business litigation. Even in business litigation, who is your judge is important. As soon as the judge was assigned in our case, if we researching that judge, what are the decisions for similar cases that this judge has
Right.
made? The reality is, like I'll go to myself. I was a judge for Social Security disability. When I'm looking at my cases, there's a large chunk that are definitely yes, and there's a chunk that are definitely no. but it's that middle chunk where it's sort of grayer and where there's more, it depends more on how you weigh the evidence. Which evidence do you give credibility to? Which evidence do you prioritize? And some of that can be related to your personal opinions or biases or how you look at the world, right? And I know for me, I tried very hard to focus on objective evidence and not to let those other factors come in. But I can't say 100% I didn't. It's very difficult not to. But even in a sort of emotionally neutral area like business litigation, we wanted to know who was the judge, because there's that sort of that grayer zone in the middle where one judge could decide one way and another judge could decide another way. It's definitely a factor.
I'm curious. You say, right, there's the definitely yes and the definitely no, and then there's the gray area. Um, what percentage of cases you think fell in that gray area?
It probably depends on what area of the law it is and where you are. I mean,
Mhm.
I would say for me as a Social Security judge, and when I say gray, it's more that it's a harder decision, right? Like you actually, it's
Mhm.
just not as clear. It's more ambiguous. For me, I would say it was probably 20% of the cases that would have fallen in that group when I was a judge, but it's going to depend on where, what area of the law you're in and sort of where you are. Some cases, for example, that rely on witness testimony, that could create more gray zone cases because witness testimony is not always perfectly reliable. It's not as discreet as I've got video, of it, right? I mean, there's more room for who you believe can and how you weigh the evidence can come into play more than if and there's somebody recorded it and you can see exactly what happened. So those are the kind of
Right,
factors that can play in.
right, right. Something interesting to speak to what you were just commenting on here in Utah, right? And I'm sure it's across the nation's like that, right? It's uh, criminal defense attorneys, right? We work with a lot of them. I've met a lot of them, and one of the things that's very common, right? You hear them, right? And they won't admit it openly, but it's something like that they did. It's a common held belief that a majority of the judges are pro-state, right? And initially that sounds like a great thing, but if you're dealing with somebody that's been overcharged, right, or somebody who is innocent, then all of a sudden, if you have a judge, right, that's pro-state, and when I say pro-state, like what I mean by that for those, or some of our listeners is where they have a discretion with that discretion, right, where they can go this way or that way, they will have a tendency of just leaning in one direction. And that could be 60% of the time, or it could be 90% of the time, right? And because there's so much discretion on so many different things, it makes such a huge impact, right? We still get letters, right, from people that whose rights were violated, that are claiming that they're innocent, and even if you don't believe that they're all innocent, some of them, right, because I know their stories. um yeah, I believe that there's a significant percentage of people that are sitting there incarcerated, some of them with lifetops, and they're not guilty of what they've been convicted of.
I
um
I think unfortunately that's true. And I mean, with DNA evidence, we found how many people were on death row that didn't actually commit the crime, right? And on lower
mhm.
level charges, it might be even higher. But you're right. I think part of that is, for example, are and I don't want to overly disparage the police. There are some very, very good police officers, but their testimony needs to
Sure.
be taken and weighed the same as other witnesses. And there are some judges who, if the police officer says it, then it happened, right?
Right.
I know I have a friend, and she is a prosecutor, a prosecutor in a county court in a state that's not California, but a different state. She said she has a 95% conviction rate. And I said, well, to me, that's a problem. I mean, if you have a 95, I just don't believe that you're filtering out the cases such that only the ones that are 95% guilty. That suggests to me there's an imbalance in the process, right? That and part of that is why people plead. I mean, if if your attorney is telling you in all honesty, right, this judge is very much pro prosecution, and that the best I can do for you is to get the charge reduced from a felony to a misdemeanor, and you got to go away for a year and not risk going away for 10, then people often feel like they have no practical choice but to accept it. Well, now they do that, and now they have a criminal record. And then when they're arrested the second time, they've got a criminal record, or they're on probation or parole and they make one little mistake and they go back in because they made a mistake. So it can really snowball. I mean, so it's what happens to the person who isn't treated fairly, but it's also what does that mean for the other people who are charged coming up behind them as far as what their decision-making process might be.
Right, right. I love that you pointed that out, that whenever you do have a prosecutor that's got a conviction rate that's that high, that it's instead of, because most people look at that as a great thing, right? They're in awe, right? They revere somebody like that. They're like, wow, they're great at what they do. And I love that you pointed out, right? As a former judge, you're pointing out that no, that should be yellow flags, red flags, whatever, right? That's a concern. Somebody that's got a conviction rate that high, something's going on, something's not right. And in the federal system, I think I don't know if it's still the case, but in the federal system, I think generally speaking, I think last I heard, and it's been a while, the conviction rate is something like 97% or higher. It's super high for prosecutors, right? To take I don't know if it's just for the ones that they take to trial or if it's just in general for all cases, but it's definitely in the high 90s, and that should be a concern. If you understand, like what you understand, what I understand, that's not something they should be bragging about. That's not somebody should be promoted to the next highest position, right? To attorney general or to some political position. That's somebody that's, you know, you might want to scrutinize just a little bit more.
That's right. I mean, look, there's a possible positive explanation, which is that all the cases there where the person wasn't guilty, they dismissed them, right? But that's not the most likely explanation. And so, yeah, it's not dispositive, but to me, it is a red flag that you need to look at the structure of the system that that person is under if there's that high of a conviction rate.
Yeah, and then to one other question regarding something you pointed out earlier, you mentioned, right, that there's you said that there's rules, right, that guide ethics rules, right, for judges. And I don't know if every state has these, but they call them here in Utah, they call them canons. Yeah, and they're essentially, right, same thing. They're almost like rules that have to be followed and so on and so forth. Um, in your time, right, you were a judge for, was it 8 years?
5.5.
5.5 years. Did you ever see anybody, any of your fellow colleagues ever like be held accountable under one of the canons or under one of the rules, right? That
Yes, I mean, so there's there's the sort of the procedural rules that's like a different thing. But as far as the ethics rules go, I did know judges who were who had disciplinary action brought against them, but also I was an administrative law judge. It's a little easier to bring a disciplinary action against us than like the United States Supreme Court is basically nearly impossible. But even for let's say a circuit court judge, it might be more challenging. But in the type of judge that I was, I definitely saw discipline. And it would typically be for things like they did something they shouldn't have during election season, which is problematic. It can also be something like sexual, like harassment, sexual harassment of staff, things like that. It could be things like lack of not protecting the confidentiality of the records, like that's a really big deal, especially I mean, for all judges, but as a Social Security judge, the records I have Social Security numbers on them, right? So we need to protect that so that the person doesn't have their identity stolen or something along those lines. And so those were the kind of things. But I definitely saw judges that had disciplinary actions brought against them because of those kind of behaviors. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So let me ask you just a follow-up question. Did you ever see any of them ever get held accountable for, say, for example, it's a tough question, right? I understand, but for maybe making a ruling during a proceeding that clearly violated established law, whether it's through, with precedents, right, established by a superior court or upholding just a basic constitutional right, any of them, right? Any of the amendments, right? Any of the Bill of Rights. Did you ever see any of them ever be, held accountable for any going against any of that?
So typically with a judge, you wouldn't expect there to be a disciplinary action over one case because there can be an argument for it. Like let's say the appeals court decided you violated the defendant's constitutional rights by this. Well, all judges are going to get decisions like that sometimes. It's when they build up, right? When there's a pattern. And so I have, at least in California, I've seen judges that have been removed for pattern type behavior, and usually it's racial or sexual or, against women or against people of color. But also sometimes it's just their aggressive, inappropriate verbal things that they've said, to people. Like there was a judge recently, there was a school that was visiting the courtroom, and one kid was fidgeting and couldn't sit still, and the judge handcuffed him. So, he was disciplined. The judge was disciplined for that. I think it was actually might have been removed. So it does happen, but usually it will take a pattern before they're going to intervene at the high level, because the appeals court said it's a constitutional violation doesn't mean there wasn't an argument that what the judge did was right. But if it's egregious and or it's repeated in a way that can be identified. And also there are organizations that will bring lawsuits if they see a pattern, like, the ACLU or other organizations might see a pattern of racial discrimination, and sometimes they can bring lawsuits. They can be high hurdles, but sometimes they're brought. But certainly, it's not that I think that every time that every judge that's a problem is getting removed from the bench or getting, counseled, because that's not true. There are a lot of judges who get away with things for a long time. And that definitely can be troublesome. And especially it can be true in jurisdictions that are smaller, where everybody's, the judge and the prosecutor and the chief of police they grew up together, and they're all sort of, buddy buddies. And, there's some environments that make it more likely than others that a judge is going to have a bias that isn't checked.
Right, right. And that's interesting, because that actually is a lot more common than I think most people realize, right? I just yesterday, it was late yesterday, I got the email this morning, because we get emails, right, from some of our listeners. And it was a gentleman that had experienced, without going into the details, just an injustice, right? And he sends me a video clip of a video that was made, right, on YouTube by someone else regarding some of the corruption that exists in that town. And it was a short video. I watched the whole thing, and it was exactly what you said, right? They're all buddies, right? The police officers, the prosecutors, and the judges, and then there's these egregious miscarriage of justices that take place. And of course, YouTube will feed more of those videos to you. So I ended up this morning spending about 45 minutes watching a series of videos in different towns throughout the nation where this is the problem, right? So you're absolutely right. And as far as getting back to the original question, right? One of the things that we talked about right before the podcast, right, which is kind of what I was driving at, and I know you didn't do criminal law, but so for example, when you have, like, say, for something like Miranda rights, right? Everybody knows what Miranda rights are, but it's not black and white like most people think, right? Miranda rights have been, over the years, have been shredded, and they continue to be shredded, and exceptions and exceptions and exceptions to those exceptions, and it just goes right into the point where custom, it becomes kind of the norm that things get in that maybe if we go back to when the decision was made, I think it wasn't Miranda made back in was it the 60s or the 80s?
I think it's the 60s, yeah.
Back in the 60s, yeah. But that's no longer the case, right? Because of all the exceptions that have been carved out.
Well, the other thing is that what the DNA evidence has shown us, a lot of the people that were convicted of those crimes actually confessed. And so there's been a lot of study now done about why people make false confessions. I just saw in an article the other day that a young man, I think in his early 20s, reported his father missing, and they got him to confess that he had murdered his father, and it turns out his father wasn't even dead. And so things like, it's not just about the Miranda, it can be about the pressure, the way that they break down people emotionally, where people confess to things just to get the interrogation over with. And they don't understand the long-term effects, so they're not mentally, emotionally able to keep fighting back because they've been held in isolation for a long time, sometimes without food or drink. There's been a lot of mental pressure. And so a lot of the cases that we know of that were false convictions were based on false confessions because of those kind of pressures.
Yeah. Awesome. No, absolutely. And Mary Beth, we're almost out of time, but I'd love to kind of end our discussion. This has been very enjoyable and insightful. I'd love to end our discussion with a question for you. Kind of a tough question, right? But I'd love to ask you, had you not experienced, right, all the trauma and abandonment that you experienced, right, in your early life, do you think you would have still became a judge? And do you think you would have still led a path, right? Your life would have led to you doing what you're doing now, which is inspiring millions of people, arguably worldwide, right? as far as how they could change their life and that type of thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I will say that without the abuse, I think professionally, I wouldn't have lost 10 years of my life, right? And really more than that because I had to recover. So almost 15 years of my life. So I would have had the opportunity to have done things that I just don't have the time to do now. And that's one of the losses that I have to live with, that I lost that time and those opportunities. On the other hand, it is true that because I have now had this, horrible initial start to my life, many, many years of drug use, and now I was able to rebuild my life in a positive direction. I am able to use that story to help inspire. I hope to help reduce stigma about drug use. I try to educate people about what addiction really is and why it's so hard to stop and all those things. So I'm sure I wouldn't be in this role if I would have had a nice, sweet life. And I try to be honest, to use my judge title right now as sort of an ear opener. I've got
Mhm.
30 years of sobriety. I'm a former federal judge. I'm on these boards for these recovery organizations. I think that helps people pay attention to me and listen to when I try to share what I think is important information. And so I do try to use, I wish I didn't have this story, but since I have it, I want to use it in a way that adds value and it can help others. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, and I love what you're doing, and I think you're gonna change a lot of people's lives. So thank you again for being on the show. Thank you for your thoughts, your comments, your insight. It's been a pleasure. Mary Beth, if people wanted to buy your book, right, or if they wanted to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
Sure. So my book again is From Junkie to Judge: One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. And I will say 30% of my book is about recovery, and it's about building that individual plan. And that's on Amazon and all the usual sites, and your bookstore has it or can get it. My website is junkietoJudge.com. And those opinion pieces I mentioned, they are on my website. And also, you can message me through my website. So if someone has a question or a speaking opportunity, feel free to do that. And then I'm also on X, Twitter, at Mary Beth _. And I do not argue with people on Twitter. But what I do is I do provide new studies about substance use and recovery, new articles about new ideas or where things are heading, and then my recovery thoughts. So I try to really make my Twitter feed useful. And so those are really the best ways to get in touch with me.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you again, Mary Beth. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to maybe a sequel.
Sure, sure.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.